Have you ever wondered what frightens people the most? Is it the sound of unfamiliar footsteps echoing in the dark? Or is it the absolute silence of a neighborhood that was always believed to be safe? A place where children were taught that as long as they rode their bikes home before it got late, everything would be fine. That night, in St. Joseph, Minnesota, there were no screams, no flashing lights, no warning signs. There was only a dark dirt road, a weak flashlight, and 3 boys who believed they were simply on their way home. Jacob Wetterling didn't know that the moment he turned his bike away from the familiar convenience store was also the moment an entire community's childhood would end forever. None of them knew that just minutes later, the sense of safety this town had trusted for decades would collapse silently. We often teach our children to fear strangers. But that night raised a far more terrifying question. What happens when the danger doesn't come from an unfamiliar face, but from someone who once lived within the community? Someone the police had spoken to, someone neighbors saw every day, someone who blended in among handshakes and polite greetings and then vanished. When Jacob disappeared, the town jolted awake as if from a long dream. Streets that once felt familiar suddenly became suspicious. Bushes along the roadside, dark spaces between houses, now carried a nameless fear. Parents began locking their doors. Children were no longer allowed outside after dark. A quiet sense of betrayal crept into every household. What makes this case so haunting is not only the disappearance of a gentle 11-year-old boy, but the truth that the person responsible may have been very close. So close that if you looked at him, you wouldn't see a monster. You would only see an ordinary man. In the years that followed, tens of thousands of leads were collected. Hundreds of suspects were investigated. Yet the largest question still hung in the air like a wound that never healed. How could someone like that live in plain sight, while one family turned on a light every night, waiting for their child to come home? This is not just the story of a missing child. It is the story of broken trust, of a child who vanished into the night, and of a community forced to face the most painful truth of all, that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it walks quietly, wearing a familiar face, and disappears along with a child's childhood. And from that moment on, America would never look at safety the same way again. Before fear had a name, St. Joseph, Minnesota, was a place where people believed evil did not exist. A small town of just over 2,000 residents, where everyone knew one another by name, by voice, by the familiar nods exchanged each morning. Here, children grew up among cornfields, long dirt roads stretching into the distance, and a sky so wide it made people believe that nothing bad could possibly hide beneath it. Evenings in St. Joseph always ended gently. Porch lights flicked on one by one. The smell of dinner lingered in the air. Football played softly on televisions in living rooms. Parents believed that as long as their children came home before it got too late, everything would be fine. At one point, the town's police chief didn't even carry a gun, not out of recklessness, but because he truly believed this was a place that didn't need one. The Wetterling family lived on the edge of town, at the end of a quiet, dead-end road. Their home was surrounded by bushes, open fields, and the natural darkness of rural Minnesota. It was the kind of place where children were given freedom, where they were allowed to ride their bikes to the store, where they grew up believing that the world, at its core, was kind. In St. Joseph, adults didn't teach children how to be suspicious. They taught them how to greet others, how to trust, how to believe that neighbors were people who would help you when you needed it, not people to be wary of. That innocence became the soul of the town, and later it became the very thing that hurt the most. That night, October 22nd, 1989. There was nothing to suggest that Joseph was about to lose its innocence. It was an ordinary Sunday. Families gathered together. Children played. There was no storm, no alarm, no doors locked out of fear. When the three boys rode their bikes away from home, no one thought it was dangerous. 15 minutes there and back, along a road they had traveled dozens of times before. A short trip in a safe town, a simple, ordinary decision. But it was precisely in the place where people believed vigilance wasn't necessary that tragedy chose to happen. Not in a dark alley of an unfamiliar city, but at the very center of trust itself. After that night, St. Joseph was never the same. The roads were still there, the fields still stretched on, but the feeling of safety was gone. People began locking their doors, calling their children home earlier, looking at the darkness with different eyes. The tragedy didn't just take a child. It took the innocence of an entire community. And from that moment on, St. Joseph entered a new era, one in which trust was no longer a given, and safety was never again taken for granted. Before he became a name spoken on national news, Jacob Wetterling was simply an 11-year-old boy growing up the way a child in Minnesota was supposed to grow up. There was nothing unusual about him, no sign that his life would one day become the haunting memory of an entire generation of parents. Jacob was born into an ordinary family with loving parents and siblings who were always close. He was a gentle, quiet child, soft-spoken but thoughtful. At school, Jacob wasn't the loudest kid in the room, but he was someone his friends trusted. At home, he enjoyed the simplest things, watching football on television with his family, eating dinner together, sitting quietly in the living room, and feeling the safety he believed would always be there. Jacob loved sports, like most children growing up through Minnesota's long winters. He played hockey, played basketball, and was always excited when there was a game. He had clear preferences. He liked the color blue. He liked steak. He liked the feeling of being at home, where everything was familiar. What made Jacob so human, so ordinary, was that there was nothing about him meant to be remembered. He wasn't rebellious. He wasn't a risk-taker. Jacob was the kind of child any parent would believe could be allowed outside for a little while, trusting that everything would be fine. That day, Sunday, October 22nd, 1989, Jacob woke up like any other day. He went fishing with his father, watched the Minnesota Vikings play, went indoor skating with his family. It was a perfect day, a day with no hint of goodbye. When Jacob put on his jacket and stepped outside that evening, no one in the family thought it would be the last time they saw him. There was no unusual farewell, no longer than usual hug. Just an ordinary moment, one child heading out, believing he would be back in a few minutes. It is that very normalcy that makes Jacob's story so painful. Because if a child like Jacob could disappear, then any child could. If a family like the Wetterlings could be torn apart, then no place is truly as safe as we once believed. Jacob was not a symbol while he was alive. He was just a boy. But precisely because he was such an ordinary boy, his loss reached the hearts of millions. And from the moment Jacob disappeared, America began to look at childhood through a different lens. October 22nd, 1989, began like a perfect Sunday in the simplest sense of the word. There was no incident, no premonition. Only the familiar rhythm of a small family in Minnesota, where weekends were meant to be spent together. That morning, Jacob Wetterling went fishing with his father. A quiet moment, just the sound of water, the wind, and the sense of safety a child believes will last forever. At noon, the family gathered to watch the Minnesota Vikings play. In the afternoon, they went indoor skating together. Everything was ordinary. beautiful in the way people only recognize once it's gone. Later that afternoon, Patty and Jerry prepared to go out for dinner with friends. It wasn't far, just over a 20-minute drive. There was no school the next day. The kids were used to being at home, and St. Joseph was safe. They believed everything would be fine. A very human belief. Very ordinary. As the house grew quieter after their parents left, Jacob stayed behind with his younger brother Trevor, his sister Carmen, and his close friend Aaron. They ate pizza, talked, laughed. Then a very childlike idea appeared. Rent a movie. Just a short trip? 15 minutes by bike. Jacob called his mother to ask for permission. Patty said no immediately. A mother's instinct. But Trevor asked to speak with their father. And Jerry, in a moment familiar to many fathers, agreed. He set conditions. They had to bring a flashlight. They had to wear reflective clothing. Small rules meant to protect his children. None of them knew that this would become the smallest and most painful decision of their lives. Not wanting to leave Carmen home alone, the boys asked a neighbor to watch her. Everything was arranged carefully. There was no carelessness, no recklessness. Only the belief that in a town like this, nothing bad would happen. When Jacob put on his jacket, took the flashlight, and stepped outside, there was no unusual goodbye. No one held him longer than usual. No one sensed it would be the last time. 3 bicycles rolled into the night, heading toward the familiar Tom Thumb store. Along the way, they heard rustling sounds from the fields beside the road. But this was Minnesota. Wind, wildlife, familiar noises. They kept going. 15 minutes later, they turned back toward home, carrying the movie they had rented. The road looked the same. The night was darker. The weak beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. Only a few minutes remained before they would be home. It was at that moment when everything seemed safest that everything changed. Not because of a reckless decision, but because of a very ordinary one. October 22, 1989, did not end with an explosion or a loud tragedy. It ended with silence. A silence that would stretch on for decades. And from that night on, not just one family, but an entire nation began to understand this. All it takes is a single moment, one very small decision, and the consequences can last forever. The man turned to the 2 remaining boys. He kept them there. Time passed, heavy and unbearable. Then it was Aaron's turn to be asked his age. 11. The man gave the order again. Run. Don't look back. Aaron ran after Trevor, his heart pounding as if it might burst. When the 2 boys found each other in the woods, they shared the same thought. Where is Jacob? They turned back. Just for a very brief moment. And that moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The road was empty. No Jacob. No man. No sound. No sign of a struggle. Only darkness remained. It was around 9:20 p.m. The road leading home was so familiar that the 3 boys could almost ride it in the dark without thinking. It was a long dirt road with no streetlights, bordered by fields and dense brush. By day, it was just an ordinary path home. By night, it became a silence so deep it was frightening. The flashlight in Jacob Wetterling's hand was the only source of light. A thin beam cut through the darkness, trembling with each turn of the bicycle wheels. They talked quietly, laughed softly, unaware that they were already so close to home. Just a few more minutes. Then, out of the darkness, a man stepped onto the road. Not from a vehicle, no sound of an engine. Just a figure appearing suddenly on the empty road, as if he had been there all along, waiting for this exact moment. He was dressed entirely in black. His face was covered by a black mask. His voice, low and rough, broke the silence. He said he had a gun, and in that instant, any thought of a childish prank disappeared. He ordered the boys to stop, to push their bikes into the ditch, then to lie face down on the ground. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Cold dirt, shallow, panicked breaths, hearts pounding violently in the chests of children who had never known real fear. The man asked each of them their age. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if this were nothing more than a procedure. When he learned that Trevor was only 10, he ordered him to stand up and run into the bushes. Run as fast as he could. Do not look back. If he did, he would be shot. Trevor ran. No thoughts. No looking back. Only raw survival instinct guiding him through the darkness. Jacob was last to be seen. Trevor and Aaron ran with everything they had toward home, their cries and screams tearing through the quiet neighborhood. When they burst into the yard, the adults' world collapsed instantly. One sentence rang out amid the panic. Jacob is gone. No one understood what had just happened. No one could believe that on the very road they had always considered safe, a child could be taken in only minutes. There were no adult witnesses, no license plate, no clear leads. That night, St. Joseph lost more than a boy. It lost the belief that darkness was just darkness. From that moment on, every empty road, every stretch of silence, carried an unspoken question. If evil could step out of the darkness that quickly, then where was anything truly safe anymore? When Trevor and Aaron burst back to the house, their cries echoed across the dark yard, urgent and panicked, so raw that the adults didn't immediately understand what had happened. The boys managed to say only one thing, broken and trembling. Jacob was gone. The neighbor girl ran to find the adults. One phone call was made in haste, then another. Inside the house that had moments ago been quiet, every sound felt stretched thin, gasping breaths, running footsteps, the pounding hearts of people just realizing that the unthinkable had happened. The 911 call was connected. On the other end of the line, the voice of a child tried to explain something he himself could barely believe. A man, a gun, a dark road. But those fragile, childlike words were met with doubt. Instead of an immediate search order, the first minutes slipped away in repeated questions. Theories were raised. Was it a prank? Were the boys making it up? Had there been an accident? And while those questions were asked, time kept moving. It was 90 minutes. 90 minutes that would later haunt everyone involved. 90 minutes that should have been decisive. When the trail was still fresh, when the abductor could not have gone far, when silence had not yet erased every trace. But that night, St. Joseph did not react like a town that had just lost a child. It reacted like a town that had never imagined this could happen. Police arrived, but instead of racing against time, they paused to doubt the youngest witnesses. It wasn't until around 10:45 p.m., nearly an hour and a half after Jacob Wetterling was last seen, that an official search finally began. By then, darkness had fully settled. The dirt road had been trampled by footsteps, and the most fragile clues may already have been lost. When helicopters lifted into the air, when search dogs were brought in, when the flashlights of hundreds of people began sweeping across fields and brush, a sense of lateness hung in the air, as if the entire town had just woken up, only to realize it was already too late. No one that night could have imagined that this delay would stretch on for decades, that those lost 90 minutes would become a symbol of a system that failed to believe the worst in time. The 911 call should have been the beginning of hope, but in this story, it became a marker of regret. Because when justice is delayed, the cost is not only time. It is an entire life that never comes home. When the first morning after the night of the disappearance broke, St. Joseph woke up in a state it had never known before. The familiar peace was gone. In its place was a sense of urgency that settled over every road, every field, every face of people who had just realized that a child had not come home. The news spread faster than anyone imagined. Within hours, local police, firefighters, volunteers, and soon after, the FBI poured into the small town. Dirt roads that once carried only the tracks of farmers' vehicles were now crowded with patrol cars. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs combed every inch of ground. Thousands of residents left their jobs, left their families, and formed long lines across open fields, holding hands, bending down to search. Every patch of grass turned over carried a fragile hope. It might be a footprint, a scrap of fabric, some small sign that Jacob Wetterling was still out there, waiting to be found. But day after day, nothing appeared. Not a single clear lead. Not a single guiding trace. Only exhaustion etched into the faces of people who refused to stop. The search did not end after a few weeks. It stretched from month to month, then from year to year. Every phone call to the police department was logged. Every tip, no matter how small, was followed. The final count reached to 70,000 leads. 70,000 hopes lit, and then, one by one, extinguished. Meanwhile, Jacob's family lived suspended between hope and despair. Their home became the center of attention. Reporters came and went. Cameras pointed directly at their most private pain. Yet they continued to appear day after day, because silence would mean allowing their child's story to be forgotten. The entire community carried that pain together. Prayer vigils, candles lit in the cold night, whispered thoughts that maybe tomorrow would bring good news. But tomorrow kept passing, each day carrying another layer of despair. That massive search ultimately did not find Jacob, but it left a deep scar on the American psyche. It showed that even when an entire community acts together, hopes together, there are still voids where human effort falls powerless. 70,000 leads. Not one strong enough to bring a child home. And in that long silence, the biggest question remained unchanged. If everyone searched, then where was the truth hiding? As time passed without answers, fear began to look for something to cling to. And in small towns like St. Joseph, that fear often takes the shape of a specific name, a specific face, a real flesh and blood person. The leads did not lead to Jacob, but they led to suspicion. Suspicion slowly turned into accusation, then into scrutinizing stares, into whispers behind backs, into quiet isolation. In the hunger for justice, the line between searching for the truth and destroying a life became frighteningly thin. Some people were pulled into the storm simply because they lived nearby, because they lived alone, because they were different. A gentle music teacher living with his elderly parents suddenly became the focus of press conferences. His home was searched under the glare of television cameras. His name appeared on the evening news again and again, as if guilt had already been decided. With no evidence, his life would never return to what it had been. In another direction, suspicion reached even more forbidden ground. When a priest was questioned, it was not just an individual under scrutiny. It was an entire system of belief that began to shake. In a community where the church was the spiritual center, asking questions was seen as betrayal. The victim's family, already drowning in grief, now faced anger from the very people who had once offered comfort. Anonymous letters began to appear, counter-accusations, calls for isolation. It was no longer about who committed the crime, but about who dared to ask the question. Meanwhile, Jacob Wetterling was still missing. And the most painful paradox slowly revealed itself. While the investigation chased the wrong suspects, the real perpetrator remained free, living an ordinary life, walking through neighborhoods unnoticed. Those who were wrongly suspected lost more than their reputations. They lost their peace, their relationships, their ability to live without the constant weight of suspicious eyes. Even as years passed and theories collapsed, those wounds never truly healed. The deepest pain of this chapter is not about who was right or wrong. It lies in the truth that, in the search for one missing child, many other lives were crushed, not by deliberate cruelty, but by collective fear and desperation. And while St. Joseph questioned whom it had misjudged, whom it had trusted wrongly, the truth remained hidden somewhere, waiting for the day it would step into the light, to remind us that justice requires more than determination. It requires clarity, because when justice loses its way, the price is always paid by human lives. While leads slowly went cold and investigations stalled, there was one thing that never went out: the light on the Wetterling porch. Night after night, no matter the snow, the rain, or the bitter Minnesota cold, that light was always left on. A message that never needed to be spoken. You still have a way home. The person who kept that light burning was Patty Wetterling, an ordinary mother thrown into a tragedy no one is ever prepared to survive. After the night her son disappeared, Patty did not allow herself to collapse. Not because she wasn't in pain, but because if she stopped, Jacob would truly disappear a second time. Every morning, Patty woke up with the same question: is there any news today? And most mornings, the answer was silence. Still, she continued. She kept making phone calls, kept giving interviews, kept standing in front of cameras, forcing her voice not to tremble, to remind America that her son was still missing. Time passed, measured in painful milestones. Jacob's birthdays, Thanksgivings with one empty chair, Christmas mornings with a gift that would never be opened. Each year, Patty placed a small cake on the table. One single candle was lit. She looked at that flame and imagined her son blowing it out. A quiet ritual repeated for 10,000 days. There were moments when waiting became a wordless burden. Patty knew the person who took her son might be living somewhere nearby, might have once stood beside her, lowered his head in sympathy, spoken words of comfort. That thought alone could break anyone. But Patty chose a different path. She turned pain into action, tears into a voice. Instead of retreating into silence, she stepped into the public eye not only for Jacob, but for every child who could become the next victim. She spoke about vigilance, about community responsibility, about refusing to treat safety as a given. For 27 years, Patty did not allow her son's story to be closed. Because for a mother, as long as she does not know where her child is, hope is still alive. The light on the Wetterling porch was no longer just a guide for one boy. It became a symbol of something greater, that a mother's love can outlast time, can resist forgetting, and can force an entire system to keep searching, even when everyone else has grown tired and turned away. There are truths that do not disappear. They are only misplaced. And in this story, that truth surfaced very early, then quietly drifted away, like a call no one heard. 9 months before the night Jacob vanished, in another small town in Minnesota, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Skirrell came home in a state no child should ever have to endure. He survived. But that survival came with a fear powerful enough to keep a child silent for years. That night, Jared was walking home after saying goodbye to a friend. It was cold. The road was empty. A blue car pulled over to the side. The man asked for directions, then said he had a gun, words chillingly familiar. Jared was forced into the car, made to lie face down on the floor, his vision completely obstructed. From the front seat came the crackling sound of a police radio, an unmistakable noise that 9 months later would be heard again in another case. The car drove through dark stretches of road, past railroad tracks, through nameless turns. Then it stopped on a deserted dirt road. There, the boy was assaulted. Afterward, the man released him near his home and delivered one final threat. Run. Don't look back. If you tell anyone, there will be consequences. Jared ran, and then he kept living. But the fear never let go. His case was recorded, handled as an isolated incident. No connection, no warning. No one thought this was the first piece of a much larger tragedy taking shape. 9 months later, Jacob disappeared in almost the exact same way. The same threat, the same command to run into the darkness, the same long silence that followed. But the two cases were never linked, not because of a lack of information, but because no one placed them side by side at the right time. Years passed. Jared grew up with the memory buried deep, until he began hearing about other attacks. Familiar details slowly resurfaced. The voice, the approach, a fear so recognizable it could not be denied. For the first time, Jared understood that what happened to him was not random, and that his silence, though not his fault, had unintentionally allowed someone else to continue causing harm. Jared's story is a painful reminder. Sometimes justice is not defeated by evil. It is defeated by fragmentation, by files that never touch, by a system that fails to see the larger picture formed by small pieces. That forgotten case was not just a missed opportunity. It is an echo from the past, reminding us that there were children who survived. And if we had listened early enough, perhaps another child would not have had to disappear into the night. There are truths that do not fade with time. They lie still, waiting for the day someone is patient enough to listen. And in this case, the truth had to wait nearly 3 decades before it could speak. For many years, Jacob's file sat untouched in cold storage rooms. Old cardboard boxes, sealed envelopes, pieces of evidence once considered meaningless. They did not tell their story. They simply waited. The outside world changed. Technology advanced. Forensic science entered a new era. And then a decision was made to look back at the past through the lens of the present. Old evidence was brought back into the light. Not because of a new confession. Not because a surprise witness came forward, but because science could now hear what humans once could not. A DNA sample taken from the assault of a boy who had survived years earlier was compared, quietly, precisely, without emotion. Machines do not feel fear. They do not feel public pressure. They do only one thing. They match the truth. When the results appeared, every hypothesis collapsed at once. The names that had once been suspected, the investigative paths pursued for decades, all of it dissolved in the face of a single undeniable line of data. The truth was no longer a feeling, no longer speculation. It became numbers. It became evidence. It became the clearest voice of all. The man who had appeared in the file from the very beginning, who had been questioned, who had once been deemed unsupported by enough evidence, finally emerged in the light of science. His name was Danny Heinrich. That moment did not bring immediate relief. It carried a different kind of pain, the realization that the answer had once been so close, So close that if science had advanced just a little further at the time, if the system had been just a little more patient, 30 years of waiting might not have been necessary. For Jacob's family, the late arrival of the truth was not a victory. It was a new wound, but a necessary one. Because at last, they no longer had to live in the shadow of endless theories. DNA carries no emotion, but when it speaks, it accomplishes what humans were powerless to do for years. It gives a name back to the offender. It restores direction to justice. And for the first time in decades, the darkness surrounding this case began to crack. The truth was buried, but it was never dead. And when the moment came, all it took was a single small sample to force a long, silent past to finally speak. The truth, when it finally surfaced, did not arrive with thunder or a dramatic arrest. It came in the cold form of data, in the heavy silence of a name that had been there since the very beginning, a name so familiar that no one was really seeing it anymore. He did not live in the shadows. He did not hide in deep woods or flee from society. He lived right in the middle of the community, on quiet streets, among ordinary mornings where people greeted each other with polite smiles. He went to work, came home, existed like everyone else. And for all those years, no one knew that a monster was walking among them. When DNA finally spoke, every piece suddenly fell into place. The shoe prints that had once been measured, the tire tracks that had been compared, the early interviews that were conducted and then set aside. All of it returned, no longer vague, no longer open to debate. His name was Danny Heinrich, a man who had once been a suspect, once been watched, once been searched, then released for lack of a single decisive piece of evidence. And in that gap, he kept living, kept blending into the crowd, kept carrying the secret of that night in 1989. When police knocked on his door, there were no screams of resistance, no panic, only the unsettling calm of someone long accustomed to not being suspected. Inside that house, they found things no one ever wants to see, signs of an obsession that had stretched on for years. Evidence that what happened to Jacob was not a sudden impulse. It was part of a darkness that had existed for a very long time. What shook the community was not only the identity of the perpetrator, but the question that followed: how could someone like this live freely for nearly 3 decades? How could he pass through prayer services, televised pleas for help, the tears of victims' parents, without ever being stopped? That truth forced St. Joseph and the entire nation to confront something deeply unsettling. That evil does not always reveal itself. It can wear the clothes of normalcy. It can live beside us in the very neighborhoods we believe are the safest. The moment the perpetrator was exposed did not bring complete relief. It brought anger, regret, and a deeper kind of pain. Because only when the monster was unmasked did people realize that it had been there all along, and that far too many years had been lost while the truth waited to be heard. There are moments when the truth, once spoken, does not bring relief. It brings cold so cold that it makes people wish they had never heard it at all. After nearly 30 years of silence, the man finally agreed to speak. Not because his conscience awakened, but because the law had closed off every possible escape. In the dim yellow light of the interrogation room, his voice was steady and flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were recounting something that had nothing to do with human life. His name was Danny Heinrich, and his confession did not come as an emotional outburst. It was a cold, methodical account, step by step, detail by detail. That night, he said, he waited. Waited on a dead-end road. Waited for children to head home. Waited for the moment when innocence would meet prepared evil. He spoke of the handcuffs, of the car, of the sound of an 11-year-old boy crying, asking what he had done wrong. Those words hung in the room, heavier than any physical evidence, because it was a question with no answer. When he heard the police radio crackling inside the vehicle, he panicked. Not out of remorse, but out of fear of being discovered. In that moment of panic, the truth reached its most brutal point. One gunshot, then another. Darkness closed in. He talked about going back, about the shovel, about not digging deep enough, about the backhoe. The details were blunt and lifeless, as if he were describing a task to be completed. There was no trembling, no repentance, only bare, unfiltered truth. For Jacob's family, the confession was the final blade. For 27 years, they had lived with the fragile hope that their child might still be somewhere alive, waiting. In the span of a few hours, all of that hope was suffocated by words spoken without emotion. And yet, at the same time, the confession ended another kind of torture, the torture of not knowing, of unanswered questions, of lying awake each night wondering where their child was. The coldest truth does not lie in the details of the crime. It lies in the realization that there are people who can live among us, carrying the darkest secrets imaginable, without revealing a single sign. The confession could not give time back. It could not erase the pain, but it placed a period at the end of a story that had stretched on for nearly 3 decades. And sometimes, in cases like this, that period, however painful, is necessary. Because only when the truth is spoken can those left behind begin to learn how to live on, with memory, with loss, and with a reality that will never again be what it once was. There are days when people are both afraid of the truth and desperate for it, because the truth can bring answers, but it can also place a final period at the end of hope. And on that day, after 27 years of waiting, the Wetterling family was forced to step through the most painful threshold of their lives. When Danny Heinrich led investigators to a desolate field in Minnesota, no one spoke much. There were no noisy cameras. No crowds, only wind, soil, and a heavy silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath. They had prepared themselves to find metal, buttons, small remnants left behind after decades of harsh winters. But the first thing to surface was a faded red piece of fabric rising from the ground as if, for 27 years, it had been trying to be seen. That was the moment when every fragile hope finally closed. There were no more theories, no more questions, no more possibility that Jacob was still somewhere, living another life. A wait that had stretched nearly 10,000 days came to an end in the most painful way imaginable. For Jacob Wetterling, the journey had ended long ago. But for his parents, that moment was a direct collision with the truth they had spent years trying to delay, the truth that their son would never walk through the door again. The porch light, kept burning for decades, was finally turned off. Not because hope had been betrayed, but because hope had fulfilled its purpose. It had kept Jacob alive in memory, in love, and in every day the family refused to let the world forget him. Finding Jacob did not bring immediate peace. It brought a concentrated grief. But within that pain was something deeply human. At least the boy was no longer lost to anonymity. At least the family now had a place they could call home for him. For St. Joseph, it was a moment when the entire community bowed its head. No more searching. No more uncertain hope. Only remembrance and the recognition that some wounds never heal, but must be faced in order to keep living. When that red piece of fabric was lifted from the earth, it was not only a child who was found. A long chapter of waiting, of prayer, of sleepless nights was finally closed. And from that moment on, the story was no longer about searching for Jacob, but about learning how to live in a world where Jacob had come home, yet would never grow older by another single day. When the truth is finally spoken, people often believe that justice will naturally follow. But in this story, justice does not arrive in the complete form people hope for. It comes late. And when it does arrive, it carries a bitterness that is hard to swallow. Even though the confession clarified everything, the law drew a cold boundary. The statute of limitations had expired. The years of silence, the delays of the past, now returned as an impenetrable wall. The perpetrator was not tried for murder. There was no sentence that formally named the crime committed on that dark night. In the courtroom, there was no moment of victory, no sense that the scales had been balanced. Only the heavy silence of those who understood that this system is not always built to heal. It simply operates by its rules, even when those rules leave human pain behind. For Jacob's family, the truth did not bring complete relief. They had answers, but they did not have a sentence proportionate to what had been taken from them. That feeling was not pure anger. It was something deeper, a sorrow born from the realization that even after nearly 30 years of waiting, justice could still stop halfway. The most painful question was not how many years the offender would be punished. It was what allowed time to slip by so quickly. Which decisions were missed, which opportunities were not taken. And the price of that delay was paid with the childhood of a single child. In that moment, justice ceased to be an abstract concept. It became a living lesson that a system is only strong when it is timely, that the truth must be heard from the very beginning, and that every minute of delay can turn into a void that can never be filled. The legal bitterness does not close the story. It opens another layer of meaning. When justice cannot fully do its job, responsibility shifts to the living. The responsibility to change the law, to repair the gaps, to ensure that similar tragedies are not trapped by statutes of limitations and collective forgetting. Justice in this case was incomplete. But that very incompleteness became the catalyst for something larger, a reminder that if a system is not fast enough to protect children, society must rise up and change it. And that is where bitterness begins to transform into legacy. When justice cannot be concluded with a complete verdict, many stories end in regret. But Jacob's story did not. Because from that inescapable pain, another path was opened, the path of responsibility, of change, and of legacy. During the years Jacob was missing, Patty Wetterling understood that waiting alone was not enough. She came to a cold realization. If she endured in silence, other children would disappear just as her son had. And so, Patty chose to step beyond the role of a grieving mother and become a voice that America could not ignore. She traveled everywhere. She met with lawmakers. She told Jacob's story not with bitterness, but with a deeply human appeal. Give parents the right to know. Give communities the tools to protect their children. In 1994, that effort took form in the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children Act. For the first time in history, states were required to establish registries to track convicted sex offenders against children. It was a foundational change, a turning point born from a child who never made it home. That legacy did not stop there. 2 years later, Megan's Law was enacted, expanding the public's right to know. Names that once could disappear by crossing state lines were no longer allowed to hide in silence. Megan's Law became an essential part of the child protection system across the United States. Jacob never had the chance to grow up, but his name grew alongside the law. It grew with public awareness, and it grew within families who came to understand that safety is not something to be taken for granted. It must be built, monitored, and protected every single day. Jacob's legacy is not fear. It is vigilance. Not hatred, but responsibility. And in that changed world, the light once left on to guide a little boy home now illuminates a path so that other children do not have to disappear into the darkness. When the story comes to an end, what remains is not only a truth that has finally been named. What remains is something deeply human, difficult to put into words, that there are losses that cannot be measured by time, and questions that will never have complete answers. We often believe that evil has a clear shape, that it reveals itself through obvious signs. But this case reminds us of something else. Evil can move quietly. It can speak normally. It can live among a community without leaving a trace. And when it strikes, an entire family's world collapses in silence. Looking back on Jacob Wetterling's journey, perhaps the most haunting part is not the crime itself, but the ordinary moments surrounding it. A decision to let a child go out. A familiar road. An evening that seemed harmless. They remind us that tragedy does not require extraordinary circumstances. It needs only a single moment of lowered guard. So what do we take from this? Is it a call to live in fear, or a call to live with awareness? Is it about distrusting everyone, or about learning to listen to our own instincts, to our children, and to the smallest warning signs we may have once ignored? If you are a parent, what would you do differently after hearing this story? If you were a child who once grew up with freedom, do you still see quiet evenings the same way? And if you are a member of a community, are you willing to ask questions, even when those questions make others uncomfortable? Justice may arrive late. The law may be imperfect. But human concern should never fade. Because every question that is asked, every conversation that is reopened, every moment when we choose not to turn away from a vague unease, can become the fragile line between safety and loss. Take a moment after this video. Look around your home. Look at the porch light. Look at the people you love. And ask yourself, have we done enough to protect one another? If you're still here at this moment, it means the story you've just heard touched you in some way. Not because of shock value, but because this is a deeply human story. A child who vanished. A family that never stopped waiting. And a community forced to learn how to go on after its sense of safety was shattered. Stories like this should not fade into silence. Because every time we listen, every time we remember a child's name, we deny evil the protection of forgetting. This channel exists for one simple reason: to tell the stories that time once tried to bury. Not to spread fear, but to remind us of the value of vigilance, of family love, and of shared responsibility within a community. If you believe stories like these deserve to be told with care, depth, and honesty, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the journeys ahead. Every subscription is more than a number. It's a gesture of solidarity, a statement that these memories deserve to be preserved. You're also welcome to leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or share your thoughts after hearing this story. Sometimes, those conversations open new perspectives, allowing cases that seem long closed to be seen again through a more human lens. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Stay safe and protect the people you love. And if you're ready, we'll meet again very soon in another story, another journey, one where the truth is still waiting to be spoken.